You're now tuning in to Performotion Podcast, where we talk powerlifting and rehab with our coaches, guests, and exercise physiologists. Hello, and today we're going to be talking about foundations of the bench press today. In our previous episode, we spoke about the squat. Naturally, we progressed things onto bench press. So I think when we talk about bench, a lot of it comes down to making sure your setup is pretty much bang on before the bar's even unracked. So that maximizes your chances, of you not losing leg drive or you not losing tension so that you fail due to something missing as you start pressing, right? So I think in this episode, a lot of our discussion will be talking about the setup first and how that'll translate over into the descent and into your concentric portion. So when we look at bench press, right, I think we need to look at the point of contact first, which is most important. So you've got your hands attached to the barbell, you've got your torso, which could either be your mid back or your neck connected to the top side of the bench, and then you've got your butt and your feet planted into the floor. So we could kind of break this all down into those kind of segments. Leanne, did you want to talk about grip width to start?
Yep, sure. I guess obviously with powerlifting, the furthest width that you can go is like the index finger on the ring. I find that usually people tend to move more towards that as they go through kind of their powerlifting journey. I guess you're just maximizing the load on the bar because you're reducing range. And I find that the wider grip, you usually have a more flared elbow position. So usually a little bit more internal rotation, which usually feels stronger off the chest. So I guess everyone's a bit different as well. Like some people find that they are stronger with that and more narrow grip. I guess just using more of their lats in that more of a tucked elbow position, but just playing around with it at the start. So, kind of stick with where you are for now and then kind of rather than like making a massive difference straight away. So like if you are super narrow, don't go all the way to max grip straight away, kind of like make your way there over time. That way it's kind of a bit of an easier sort of progression towards that wider position.
Yeah, I'm in the same camp as you where when we are working towards trying to build the biggest bench press we can, I'd like to bias towards building towards max grip. Just because you're leveraging the most amount of musculature, right? Like when you are in that max grip position, you do get to leverage the pecs and put them in a more advantageous position when you do develop the arch. All the muscle fibers kind of line up together and you should be able to press things using more muscles. Like you've got your tricep and shoulders, they're already involved when you start with the narrow press. Think of like close grip bench press, right? That's predominantly all tricep and shoulders. And then the wider you go, the more you're going to involve the pecs into that as well, especially as you flare and keep everything in line. I guess we could talk about, and it might start getting a bit nuanced already, but talking about like internal rotation and external rotation in the hands, right? Because like you said, Leanne, like when you do go wider, you do influence a bit more internal rotation, a bit more flaring. And the positioning of your hands can also influence that as well, right? It's kind of like a dog wagging its tail versus getting the tail to wag the dog, right? If you turn your hands outwards, it's going to influence the whole humerus and things like that to flare up, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Sam's losing
Yeah, I know
because
what you
of
mean.
the analogy.
I've never heard that before. That is the best thing ever. That's got to be the clip for this episode. I think, like with hand position, I think probably we all kind of now bias towards that naturally internally rotated position purely because it enables us to keep that outside hand pressure and keep the barbell stacked right over the wrist. I guess probably the extreme of when people would move away from a slight bit of internal rotation of the hand would be that like more extreme version of a close grip bench. So think like a SSJ Bob or someone like that who's very much just like straight up and down, very, very close grip, versus like a Sean Noriega or like a full like Japanese bulldog kind of grip, very high arch, very flared elbow position, which is full internal rotation of the hand.
So if you have that more stacked wrist position, I think it's counterintuitive, right? Because when you say stack and you have everything in line, there's still a bit of wiggle room with the wrist and the hand, right? Because if you were to fully extend the hand and then you hold that extended position with that slight internal rotation, the barbell is then sitting flush against hand, against wrist, against elbow. Versus if you could also be in the camp where, if you think stacked wrist, you need to balance your hand over the barbell. So I'm also biased to think like if you can hold just slight extension, and that might even require you to use a wrist wrap for external support as well. I find that long term that to be a more stable position to press the most amount of weight possible.
Yeah. And just like for listeners that might not be kind of in tune with like those positions, when we think about extended wrist, we think about like bringing your knuckles towards your forearm. So yeah, that's typically where most powerlifters now use a wrist wrap to support the wrist. So you can have that little bit of wrist extension where the hand just sits back into itself, and then like you said, Danny, the bar is then just sitting like into the hand, a nice, like a nice relaxed position right over the wrist.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that covers the hand quite in depth, I believe. I guess the next portion we could look into in terms of point of contact is setting the neck and setting the torso. Mobility allowing, I think most people can access getting their mid back onto the bench. But when we start looking at trying to develop the arch and trying to maximize your leverages towards a bench press, we tend to see people try and set themselves up onto the neck rather than the mid back, right? So lifting your torso or your thorax to be able to press onto the neck as your surface area to press on, so that pretty much your whole upper body can then get off of the bench. Because imagine if your mid back is connected to the bench and that's the point of contact, you can't lift it and actually create an arch from that position. The only place where your arch can then develop is coming from the lower back, right?
I think as well, if like you're further onto your neck, it gives your scaps a little bit of room to move rather than if they're fixed on the bench. So like being able to get as high up onto your neck gives your shoulders and the scaps room to actually be able to move through range as you press.
Yeah. And I think with that, right, if you can set that point of contact first, then everything else kind of comes after it. The way I like to conceptualize it is everything else around your body is set up to get you to press into your neck as much as possible. So when we talk about leg drive, setting the butt on the bench, all that is positioned so that you can push and get your neck to press into the bench as much as possible. Cool. So the next point we could talk about then is actually leg drive. And I think this is where things can change quite a bit. You've got, your foot position, the toe angle. I like to think of setting your feet starting with vertical shins kind of as like the default position, so that you can, again, try and work towards getting that pressure into the neck. Reason being is, if you start too close up towards the bench and you end up extending, you end up just flexing the knee, you're not maximizing the amount of quads that you can get to push into the bench, right? However, on the flip side of things, if you put your feet too far forward, you get more quad activation and you can push to the ground. However, the problem is, if you're elongating your body, you may struggle to actually keep your arch as you press into the bench. And some people I've seen can also like end up slipping with their feet on the bench. How do you guys kind of see leg drive? Sam, did you want to jump in on this one?
Yep. So I normally just start with wherever the athlete can feel their legs the most, like kind of like what you were alluding to, Danny, in terms of like being able to like extend and push the feet down and away into the ground. And then also before in terms of creating that high arch position. So whatever like position they can get their feet in that allows them to really drive the torso up the bench and get onto the neck and upper traps as much as possible. that's where I'll generally start. And it's going to be very much like kind of individualized from person to person. From there, you can obviously start playing around with whether you move to a more positive shin angle or like a negative shin angle. Now, I know people call these different things. I would say positive shin angle is where the feet move further away from yourself, whereas negative shin angle, the feet move more underneath you. I find typically, Shannara and I did a post on this, typically like shorter torso lifters might be more biased towards a more positive shin angle. So this is where you'll typically see like maybe the feet turned out, the feet really far away from the body, because it allows them to still keep their hips planted on the bench and create that high arch in the torso. Whereas if we take like someone like myself, a bit more of a longer torso, a bit more of like a taller person in general, I bias more towards a neutral or slightly negative shin angle because it allows me to essentially just keep my hips planted, really push down to the ground and get as much arch as possible. So they are some considerations that you can take into account, whether kind of thinking about if you should go further back or further forward in terms of like your torso length. But I think at the end of the day, it's where the athlete can probably feel that active tension in the quads throughout the whole bench, where they can feel like their quads are kind of under load, they're burning, and they feel like that good contact in the ground with their feet, and where they can kind of hold that throughout a whole set or throughout a whole single.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you bring up a really good point about, your individual leverages, whether you have a short torso, long torso, your leg length as well. I think obviously if you have that shorter torso, you are able to get your pelvis into a position where you can arch it forward, roll it forward, or anterior pelvic tilt.
Yeah.
And that can help you drive the legs through the ground, right? I think for larger individuals, it's more difficult to get into that position where, you're tilting your pelvis forward so that you can push the ground. So I find larger people tend to struggle with trying to get that quad dominant leg drive position, right? Just because there's only so much bench available when you are pressing. That's kind of the constant between someone who is a short torso or has those leverages versus someone who has long torso. Like the bench stays the same, right? So you may find a larger individual has to have their feet set up outside the frame of the bench and actually have to press. I tend to try and cue anterior pelvic tilt as much as possible. But I do, you kind of also have to accept that, like, for someone such as yourself, Sam, like a larger individual might not be able to access that range of motion and feel as much quads compared to someone who has that short torso, can actually like roll their pelvis forward and really dig into the ground. So I think leverages, like you said, definitely plays a role.
An easy sign for me and some of my athletes is like just like where the foot pressure is. Like if my feet end up going too far away, I find I'll be very heel dominant, and then coinciding with that, also not getting much leg drive. Whereas if I can just find my feet in that sweet spot where I can kind of feel my whole foot down to the ground, and the whole kind of like ball of the foot, like almost like midfoot pressure, just like squat and deadlift. That's often where I'll be able to feel the most amount of leg drive in quads in general. As soon as myself, being quite long-legged, if my feet end up too far away, it's just like my toes are coming up, I'm all on the heels, and then that's when I'm getting like the hips popping too.
I was just going to say as well, like with the foot pressure, I tend to like cue like inversion. So like kind of letting your feet roll onto the inside of the ground. That way you can kind of push both onto the inside and across the ground as well. So it's kind of like onto the big toe and on the inside. You should feel like really strong leg pressure and quads turning on really well if you can do that.
Yeah. And I guess the next transition we can go to then is, so ticking things off, you've got your grip set. We can talk about neck pressure or mid-back pressure, talking about the legs to set that up. And the next step I find is going to be breathing or bracing, right? And this portion is very different to what you'd hear in squatting and deadlifting, where, we're trying to teach the stack, trying to maximize as much intra-abdominal pressure as possible in those two movements. It's almost the complete opposite in bench press. We almost want like zero ab pressure, and we want to be able to maintain all of that pressure going into the chest, right? So all the fundamental stuff you hear about breathing, bracing, for your squat, you pretty much want to do it in reverse. So when someone's saying like, you don't want to be breathing into your chest, you want to do that in your bench press, because that's the point of contact where you want to gain the most amount of stability. And then the rest of the body can kind of flex around that, right? So I like to think of it as you're trying to create the most amount of expansion in your torso as much as possible, right? So rather than having this stacked position, we want to almost think of it as a scissor where your ribs are flaring up and away from your pelvis as much as possible. And then your pelvis is trying to move away from your ribs. So you end up in this flared position or rib flare position. So then, like I said, you can maximize the amount of leg drive and you get as much neck pressure as possible. Do you guys have any specific ways you like to teach breathing or bracing?
With bench press, I guess, like you said, it's quite different to, say, a squat or a deadlift. Something that I like to teach is usually taking a breath before you actually have unracked the bar. So especially if it's just one rep, if you can be able to, I guess, hold your breath for that first rep rather than like unracking it, taking an exhale and then like bracing from there. If you can take your breath in before you unrack, you'll be able to get a really solid rib cage and chest position from there. So kind of like breathing into your upper chest and your neck rather than breathing low into your belly is something that I like to cue with bracing.
Yeah, I'm very much the same. So very much just like that high chest breath, and trying to hold as much tension through the whole unrack. So taking the breath like before you unrack the bar, and then like as a general rule of thumb, through reps or through an unrack, if you feel like you have to breathe, you're only just letting small sips of air out. So like you're letting air out to kind of release the pressure, but to keep the same position in your chest. So it might just be like, very like small sips, or like very small movement in the mouth. We're just letting like a tiny little bit of air out, but you're able to keep the high chest. I think I've explained this before on a podcast, but it's like you're farting in public and you're trying to just like let it out really slowly. You just like let out a little bit at a time so no one hears it. It's like the same thing, but it's your mouth on bench. For the people listening.
I want to add to that as well. I found another helpful way to think about breathing to try and get it into the chest. And I think I heard it from Esther from Reformance. Shout out to Esther if you do listen to this. But imagine like you're trying to fit into really, really tight pants and you need to suck in your bellies to get your pants on, right? So when you do that, you're pulling your abdomen in and then you're flaring your ribcage up when you do take that breath. All of that should minimize the amount of pressure going into the diaphragm, and then it just ends up filling the lungs. So I found that personally, when I do give that to clients, that really drives the point home of, pushing all that air pressure into the chest.
Yeah, I like that. I haven't heard that one before. That's a good one.
Yeah, really helpful. I guess then we could talk about how this all plays then into the actual bench press itself, right? So, grip kind of sets up how much musculature you're able to use when you actually are doing the press. And then neck pressure and foot pressure kind of make up the whole foundation of the bench press. If you can maximize those two elements and really master those, the eccentric portion and the concentric portion kind of just does itself, really. It all comes in the setup. So before we move forward, I think it's just really important to emphasize, if you can tick off these little things, almost like a checklist, like, is my neck pressure as much as it could be? Is my leg drive in the best position possible? Then you can kind of think about maintaining those things during the eccentric and the concentric portion. So during the eccentric, as you're lowering, I think one common issue I see is losing that pressure or seeing the bar dump forward as you start to lower it, right? Because as the bar comes down, it's also traveling forward and it's changing your center of mass while you're lying down on the bench. So as it comes down, it's actually drifting forward towards the feet. So then if you don't have that leg pressure that's trying to resist it and trying to push in the opposite direction, you're pretty much just going to lose the whole arch falling forward essentially. So I think something useful here to try and maximize leg drive, we could look at it programming wise and cueing wise. Cueing wise, you could talk about it with, trying to push back into the bench so that your neck doesn't lose contact. And then I think programming wise, the use of tempo bench press can really give you time to think about that specifically, right? Like being able to maximize your leg drive and really feel your quads burn, so that you don't lose it moving forward.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm a big fan of tempo bench or tempo singles, just from like a purely skill acquisition like standpoint. Like, just like one primary day might just be a tempo single followed by normal competition tempo backdowns. Purely just to practice like holding everything on for that one rep. Cueing wise, I also like that like leg extension into the ground. So like, imagine you're doing like a leg extension, like on a leg extension machine, but you're just pushing the feet down and away on the eccentric too, and just trying to like really push the feet away from yourself, kind of like what you were getting to, Danny. Like you're pushing in the opposite direction as to like where your body is going. I like that too. And like the whole like meets the like meet the bar like halfway with your chest, like on the way down, like you're trying to not let the bar come to you. You're trying to get up to it and meet it halfway.
You put out a post recently with Dave as well, and you spoke about trying to get the bar trying to get your chest to chase the bar, right? And we're kind of following on from the eccentric into the pause/press portion. Do you want to explain that a little bit more? Because when I heard that, I found that to be really, really helpful for certain people who's losing that chest position.
Yeah. So it's kind of like this concept of like you want to chase the bar with your chest. So like obviously, when we're handling something heavy and we're holding it in the hands, it wants to push you down, right? So like if you sink bench, the ribs definitely get pushed down by the barbell. But even if you soft touch, there's still going to be that, under heavy load, there's still going to be that element where the barbell is like, it's crushing you, right? So it's very common for lifters to, once they get used to having this like high leg drive, high arch position, where everything stays really switched on the eccentric, when you got to think about pushing the weight, you can easily forget about that. So you can easily just kind of like pancake out in the chest. The chest collapses, and then that's when like the arms have to do too much work. So the easy way to kind of maintain that chest position is to like think about as you push, not only are you pushing with your arms, but you're also trying to like chase the bar with your chest and try and like reach up as well with your chest, almost like push with your chest as well. So that's just going to help you kind of return in the same position that you started in, and kind of minimize the effect of the weight of the barbell pushing the ribcage down. The side effect or the benefit is that it's going to be a lot more efficient because your elbows can then come through lockout a lot easier, and the triceps aren't working as hard.
For sure. Yeah. I think as well, something with leg drive, I find a lot of beginners tend to plant their hips on the bench like really hard. So actually being able to just soften that touch of the hips and the butt on the bench, so you can actually, it's not obviously like with powerlifting, you have to have your butt on the bench, but like being able to have it up enough that you can hold your leg drive on as hard as you can, because that's something that I find a lot of people miss, is like they're just sinking their butt into the bench and they're missing out on a lot of leg drive. So being able to kind of let that it sort of feels like you're floating along the bench, but it's just touching, so that it's still like comp standard, but being able to do that, you'll be able to hold your legs on really hard.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's especially important if you're already not leveraged to bench, if you can manage to get that floating butt sensation, like you said, Leanne, it helps you just that little bit more to almost like be a more short torso leveraged bencher, right? It's almost kind of creating this position where you're almost in like a decline press, which is what I guess comp benching is. It's like it's a contorted decline press position.
I'll go really quick. That's like me, like with my leverages. That's where I get like with that kind of floating hips, because it is easier for my because I got long legs. It is easier for my hips to like pop off the bench. It can be quite dangerous, like with me kind of floating the lines of trying to have that like constant leg drive floating hips position because it can pop so easily. So that's where adjusting your feet position and then having a closer look at like other variables can help with that. Like I found like if I just move my feet a little bit further underneath me, it helps me to stay a little bit more planted. And that's when you can kind of go through this whole like trial and error phase with like bench technique, like when you get down the line, because there is so many things you can tweak and change. You don't want to fall down a rabbit hole of trying to change too much, but there's a lot of like little 1%, 2%, 3% things that you can kind of tweak to keep like adjusting your position and trying to make it stronger.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess we could kind of follow this up then with the actual concentric portion. And again, if you do the setup right, the press should almost cover itself. You've leveraged yourself in the best position possible to get through the hard part, right? So this is where the hardest part of the press comes. But I think one common issue or a mistake that some people run into is still thinking of it as like this linear press going straight up, right? But when you are in this more arched position, this more decline position, pressing straight up is almost pressing away from your body, right? You're kind of moving you're moving the bar away from the musculature that's going to actually aid in the pressing. So think shoulders, tricep, pec, right? So an easy fix for that is literally just think of pressing back, and I think that's a fundamental one I've heard in the very start of my powerlifting career. Pressing back towards your face so that you can involve the shoulders, you can involve the tris, and the bar stays over the chest. Because I think it's very difficult to recover a bench, straight off the press, and the bar's already traveling forward towards the belly. There's much less musculature involved there versus close up towards the face. So, but if you've already pressed it down towards the legs, at maximum loads, it's almost borderline impossible to save.
Yeah, that's like where you see like someone like a panna, right? Like, the bar kind of shoots back off the chest, and then he just like stays in that almost like guillotine press, like really kind of like underneath the barbell, stacked underneath the barbell, and he can just grind it out forever. And that's like kind of where like center of mass comes into bench press in terms of being able to stay balanced under the bar on the concentric, so you can just keep pushing. Because like if the bar goes too far one way, like too far down your body, like you said, there's less musculature involved to kind of save you and help you get through that sticking point.
Yep, for sure. I think as well, like if we look at powerlifting style of bench press, it's literally just elbow extension. That's one way I kind of like to look at it. If you can get your setup nailed and like every piece kind of locked in, then all you should kind of be thinking about is like extending the elbows on the lockout rather than like over pressing with the shoulders. If you can just literally think about like literally just extending the elbow, then you're going to be able to hold and maintain your shoulder position and rib cage position as well.
Yeah. Did you want to explore that a little bit more, Leanne, as well? Because I think you make an interesting point of not over pressing. That was a key word I heard. And I think it applies really well to when you look at like rep work and accumulating reps. Over pressing is a common issue. So did you want to talk about that a bit?
Yep. So I guess like with the powerlifting bench press, you want to be able to maintain a level of retraction with the shoulders and depression. So if you can maintain that position, that's when you'll be able to kind of just think about locking out the elbows without over pressing. So if you are over pressing, you're kind of going to lose your shoulder position on the bench. And then as you go through the reps in a set, it's going to become harder and harder to, I guess, press the load, because you're losing your rib cage position, your ribs start to fall down, your shoulders kind of tend to fall up towards your ears, and you lose that retracted and depressed shoulder position, which just makes it harder to, I guess, essentially press the load off the chest.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. And I guess to wrap things up, we could kind of go backwards, right? Like the concentric portion is going to be the hardest part of the lift. And if you can kind of reverse engineer everything and think like, where does my feet need to be able to get through this portion as best as possible? How do I leverage my torso position to allow me to stay as arched and have as much stability as possible? And kind of work backwards from there so that your setup is almost in the best possible position to be able to perform the concentric part of the press, right? And I think there's so many things that could go wrong, but it does take time, right? Like we did cover a lot in this podcast where, there's a lot of cueing, there's a lot of tweaking you can make, but if you can leverage one thing at a time and try and make these tiny, tiny improvements and make them feel automatic, then over time, once you start layering on these cues or techniques, that's where you can end up building as stable of a bench press as possible, rather than trying to change all these little things at once. I think is going to be the most helpful. So again, think big picture, maximize as much neck pressure as you can, and you can do that via the legs and via your breathing. And from there, make those small, tiny changes over time. So then you can maximize that. Feel free to jump in, Sam.
Yeah, I was going to say also, just to wrap up, I liked what you said before about like having that checklist, and just want to kind of like reiterate that, like, because bench can be so tricky with so many moving parts. Like I myself like having a checklist, of just like 2, 3, 4 key things that I'm focusing on in each set or in each session. So, like I slide back and it's like, all right, big legs, set the grip. It's okay, hand pressure's here. And then that's done. You don't have to really think about that as much because it's already locked in. And then, you unrack, it'll be like legs on. And then through the eccentric and the concentric, it's just chest position. So like trying to like shorten and find like little kind of key checkpoints or key words that you can kind of run through whilst you're going through your setup and tick everything off. And then, once something becomes more automatic, you can move away from it and then you can focus on something else. But yeah, because there is so many moving parts, it's good just to kind of have that checklist of technique points, and almost just like work through one thing at a time, like in the movement, but also just like on technique wise, like just not trying to change too many things at once.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good way to wrap things up. Think about sequencing, tick things off as you go, and then over time, when you do get the chance to review your technique, think about tweaking one portion of the checklist at a time. But yeah, thanks guys for listening, and we'll see you in another episode.